This is the podcast of the World Affairs Council of Greater Houston, where the world's voices converge, from ambassadors to analysts, from Houston to every corner of the globe. We go beyond the headlines, bringing you direct insights into diplomacy, global events, and the international forces shaping our future. Because understanding the world starts with listening to it.
Read his work at the Washington Post already. I was discussing it earlier today. Being a journalist is not easy. Being a journalist covering geopolitics, what's happening with Saddam Hussein or Putin or Khomeini, that's probably easier to make enjoyable and engaging and readable. I think it's a real skill as a business and economic and trade journalist to make it enjoyable and fun and relatable to read every day in this book, because this is a great book. Even if you just want to get an idea of really the overview of U.S. and kind of global economics of the last roughly 40 years or so, it's a great overview. And if you're thinking what's called, the world's worst bet, how globalization went wrong, it also says, what would make it right. And I would say David is very fair and honest. He's balanced, equally critical of Republican presidents, Democratic presidents, Democratic Congress people and senators, similarly Republicans. Even of yourself, you mentioned at the beginning of the book, you yourself hadn't judged this correctly. You maybe give us an idea why, what kind of tripped the light in your head to do this? This did not just emerge in 2016 with Bernie Sanders and Trump and populism, but maybe what kind of made you think this is something we need to do? And one thing I thought was interesting in your book was you mentioned a lot of the economic models we were using were comparing previous economic models to U.S. trade with advanced, high cost, high labor, paid labor in Japan or Europe. And we had to realize that these same models are not going to work when you move to huge, trade between the high wage United States or Europe and developing countries where they might be paying 10 of that. Can you talk about what kind of kicked off your idea that this is a book you need to write?
Sure. First, thanks very much, Reen. Everybody hear me okay?
Excellent.
I want to thank the council for having me here. I want to thank all you folks for coming out at a time of year when I'm sure you've all got about a dozen things you need to do other than listen to me talk. So I'm really gratified by the interest in the book and having a chance to discuss it. But I started thinking about writing something that became the world's worst bet about 3 years ago as I was preparing to cover the 2022 G20 summit in Bali, Indonesia. Just one of the many hardship assignments that Washington Post has sent down recently. And as I was getting ready for that event, I was struck by how the landscape or how the outlook for it was so fractured relative both to the aims and objectives of the G20 and when compared to the earlier summit that I recall from 25 years earlier that Bill Clinton had hosted in Denver in 1997. And so at that summit, which I think was sort of a high watermark of enthusiasm over U.S.-style globalization, Boris Yeltsin attended. It was a summit at the G8, after all, the first summit of the G8. Yeltsin was there as the human embodiment of hopes for Russian democracy. The U.S. economy was cranking along like gangbusters. The stock market had 3 or 4 years in a row with double-digit returns. U.S. officials were lecturing Europeans and Japanese that basically we had cracked the code, and they needed to just do what we were doing. I think would work out. And a few weeks after the summit, on the other side of so tremendous changes that were occurring around that period, Chinese President Jiang Zemin rang the opening bell on Wall Street. So here's a guy who's still, after all, a leader of the Chinese Communist Party, and he's at the New York Stock Exchange ringing the opening bell. Now you fast forward to the G20 summit in Bali, and it looked nothing like that. Russian President Vladimir Putin couldn't even show up for fear of being arrested on an international war crimes warrant. Chinese President Xi Jinping was there, but proved very cooperative on a number of issues. He was politically lecturing the Canadian Prime Minister over an alleged leak from their private conversations. Things were so contentious that they couldn't even get the leaders together for the customary so-called family photo that they always take at the end of the meeting to reflect on some harmony. So in thinking about just how different these two meetings in and of themselves may not have mattered all that much, but just as symbols of their times, I was struck by how much had changed and how much had not really gone according to our initial hopes. And as Ron said, I certainly would put myself in the camp of the conventional wisdom of the 1990s and post-Cold War era, when it looked like democracy and free markets were spreading all over the world. U.S. leaders certainly were quite optimistic at the time. They promised that globalization would mean double-barreled win for Americans. We'd get widespread shared prosperity here at home, and we get peaceable, more harmonious international environment as countries like Russia and China joined the U.S.-led international order and began opening up their own political systems under the influence of expanded trade. And obviously, as I thought about it in 2022, and as we can all see today, that's not the world we've ended up in. The U.S. has now turned its back, more or less, on the system of global integration that made it rich. Russia and China doubled down on their state-centric economic systems, and the International Monetary Fund and other experts are warning of a new global divide. So I wanted to figure out what the hell had gone wrong. How did we get from where we started in the 90s to where we ended up?
Yeah. And this might seem like a kind of pedestrian question, but I think it's good. Could you maybe just give us your idea of a working definition of globalization? Because I think inherently a lot of us think of trade, of old-time mercantilism, goods going back and forth, dictatorships. But in a lot of ways, what's much more important was not just the exchange of services, but the massive and easy exchange of capital, especially those distorted exchanges that would happen over the years between the U.S. and China. But can you give us an idea of how you kind of describe the totality of globalization, and I suppose maybe within that definition, what parts did maybe American and Western kind of economists and policymakers kind of predict correctly, and then we'll get into it more. Which parts did they kind of miss completely?
Yeah, it's a good question. And trade and globalization are words that get often used, including by people who should know better, as almost synonymous, and they're really not. Trade is some said. To me, I think of globalization as referring to the easy movement across barriers of goods, services, people, money, technology, and ideas. All of the processes and phenomena that have helped knit the world together, made the world smaller, right? And to answer the second part of your question, I think I have to go back to something you referred to in your first question that I didn't answer, which is the extent to which economists got this wrong. Because policymakers got it wrong, but economists got it wrong as well. And part of that was a failure to recognize the differences between expanded trade between the United States and low-wage countries like China and Mexico, how that would differ from the impact of expanding trade between two similarly developed economies. And in the late 1990s, as China was preparing to join the WTO, which Congress was preparing to pass the legislation that would facilitate that, the International Trade Commission did a study looking ahead to what that would mean for the U.S. And the prediction at the time was that Chinese imports, once China joined the WTO, would rise by only 7% a year. And instead, in the first year they went up by 25%. Chinese imports into the United States. So in 1 year, up by 25%. In the first 3 years, up by 50%.
Right.
That was an extraordinary underestimation, I guess we could call it. The other part that people got wrong, and I should say, none of this is to say that people were venal or corrupt or stupid. People make mistakes, and I think it's important to hold people accountable when they do make mistakes and to try and understand why mistakes occurred so we don't repeat them. But I think growing out of the heady feeling of the time, it is, if you think about what folks my age and the age of most of you folks in the audience lived through in those late 1980s, early 1990s years, the collapse of the Berlin Wall, the disappearance of the Soviet Union on Christmas Day, 1991, a Christmas present that I don't think many people anticipated. So the uprising in Tiananmen Square in 1989, all those changes were extraordinary, once in a lifetime sort of developments. And if you're somebody who has lived through that, you're a policymaker, now you're trying to look ahead. Times are great in the United States, better than any of our allied countries. We have no peer competitor on the international stage. I think it's understandable why people would make some of these errors, get some of these prognostications wrong. But the expectation was that despite the Chinese authorities' success in repressing Tiananmen Square, that inevitably as commerce continued, as trade relations expanded, that the same developments that we had seen elsewhere in East Asia, where expanded prosperity led to political pluralism and change over time, that would happen in China as well. There was a study done, I think in 1995, by conservative economist named Henry Rowan, worked for Dick Cheney in the early 1990s. I think Rowan that Dick ran in those years. He published a paper that predicted that China would become a fully democratic country, just like the other East Asian countries, once per capita income reached, I think it was $15,000 a year. And so that was sort of the atmosphere in which people were operating. And, I moved to China, my wife and I and her kids moved to China about 6 months after China joined the WTO. And in those early years, it was quite possible to feel like those predictions were coming true. You could see the change occurring throughout the society. It was a real vibrancy in China, and the incredibly rapid pace of change where you'd see, depending on which way you looked, driving to work in the morning, you'd either see a fleet of dark blue, always dark blue for some reason, Buick minivans, or there'd be a donkey-drawn cart pulling, a load of farm goods. And so there was a real sense of this place that had been, due to its own policy areas, left behind for decades, now rapidly catching up, and doing so in a way that seemed to herald political change as well. But that turned around.
Right. And again, this is not a hit piece on globalization. We're correctly, no kind of force in modern history has brought more people out of abject poverty. Roughly 1.5 billion people, hundreds of billions of those in China alone, pulled out of poverty. There's arguments that countries that trade together at least are less likely to go towards each other. There are exceptions, obviously, but so far, at least, it is held. For the United States, it was hugely beneficial for especially big exporter and multinational American companies, and especially their shareholders. So it's good. You're not knocking on that, but I suppose, can you talk about the realities of the wage disparities? And you talk with some prevalent labor leaders who say, wait a second, we can never compete at 1/6 of the pay of a Chinese worker. One of the companies I remember you mentioned here, I don't know if it was 20 years ago or so, I think the wage you said was 15 cents an hour. You said they got 1 day off roughly 1 day off a month. They got 10 days off a year, about 1 a month, and that was what you're competing against. How long did it take Americans and American factories to start feel what we call the China shock? And maybe you could explain what the China shock is.
Yeah, a lot there. Let me take a couple of cracks at it. First, you're entirely right. This is not an anti-globalization book. To my mind, the problem that I'm discussing or trying to analyze is not globalization. It's our failure to respond adequately to globalization. It's a failure to develop adequate guardrails, rules of the road, and what have you. When people ask me, are you for or against globalization? To me, that's like being for or against capitalism. I'm for capitalism, but I don't want 6-year-olds working in coal mines. I don't want factories dumping their waste in the same rivers that I get the drinking water from. Are you for or against the automobile? Well, I like fast, sexy sports cars, but I wanted to have airbags. I wanted to have seatbelts. I wanted to have a fuel gauge, so I knew when I'm going to be running the gas. And that to me was failed. The problem was our response, or inadequate response to this brave new world that we're going into. Because you're quite right, and I say this explicitly in the book, 1.5 billion people raised out of the worst sort of crushing poverty of the developing world. And that is a tremendous human achievement. All those lives immeasurably improved in a way that an earlier generation could only have dreamt of. The problem is that for an American politician, that's not going to win you any votes in Ohio or Pennsylvania or Michigan. But globalization did spread enormous benefits here in the United States. It spread them. I think of it as like frosting on a cake across the entire economy. We all benefit. We all benefit from inexpensive goods from China that help keep inflation under check for something like 50 years, increased purchasing power for the average American household, $1,500 per household in the years between 2000 and 2007. So literally the dollar went farther. So Americans benefited. We had a better mix of jobs, better availability of products. When I was a kid growing up in Connecticut, we had fresh fruit and vegetables for about 6 weeks a year. The rest of the time it was canned food cocktail. Now, if I throw corn on the cob in the middle of a blizzard in February, I can get it thanks to trade. So none of that is to be discounted. The problem is trade theory should have, and as we should have understood trade theory, was that while these gains were significant but spread across the entire economy, the costs were even more significant in individual cases, and they were concentrated, like economic tumors. They were concentrated among specific cohorts of people, those with the least education and the fewest occupational skills, and they were concentrated in specific communities that were dependent upon basic manufacturing. And so even as new opportunities were being created for software designers, investment bankers, or what have you, that doesn't do the guy who just got laid off from a job at a tire factory in Northwest Tennessee any good. And so that was the costs were concentrated.
And then just last to come, okay, a broader question, and obviously it's impossible to know. There are the proponents, and they're all proponents to agree, would say globalization is a force that's happening. It's how you react and adjust to it that will make the difference. But they would probably say it is inevitable if the United States stayed back and stayed isolationist, stayed protectionist, that huge volume of trade would have occurred between Europeans and Japanese, Koreans, and developing world and China. We'll turn, maybe at the end, you conclude the book with a great interview with Bill Clinton, ironically, Democratic president who probably in some ways had the most typically Republican administration in terms of trade in modern history with NAFTA and China and the WTO. But your book, you interview almost every major United States trade representative. That's the United States' highest trade negotiator for Democratic and Republican administrations for the last 20, 30 years. Heads of the Fed, Powell, many others, Janet Yellen, What is your sense with them? Like, was this inevitable? And was there any way the U.S. could have stayed back, or was that impossible?
Yeah, good question. And I think the short answer is no, the U.S. could not have stayed back. And it goes back to my earlier point that it's not globalization that was the problem. It was what we did or didn't do in response. And I think of Clinton as sort of the godfather of U.S.-style globalization, both during his time as president and when I interviewed him a couple of years ago. To my mind, there is no American politician before or since who has been able to articulate what was happening in the global economy in a way that the average voter could understand. He understood it, I think, better than most. He understood what was coming. And he used to say globalization is not a policy choice, it's a fact. And that's true. Many of the changes and many of even the downside costs that I discussed in the book were coming at a slower pace, perhaps, thanks to technology and other circumstances. But where we failed was what I described in the subtitle as the globalization gamble, which was, I think in essence, policymakers of the 90s made an implicit bet that we could enjoy all those benefits of globalization, which I discussed, without paying too much attention to the costs, the risks, the downsides. And those costs fell into four buckets. Disadvantaged factory workers, those folks I talked of with the fewest skills, who, in the absence of adequate government assistance they've been promised, found it difficult to impossible to get their footing in this new globalized economy. Second was supply chains that were optimized for low cost and efficiency, but that proved brittle when stressed and ultimately left the United States dangerously dependent on single sources for critical materials. Third was unfettered capital flows, global capital flows that contributed to crises in the emerging markets, the developing world in the late 90s, and ultimately made our own housing bubble and bust worse than it otherwise would have been. And then finally, as I mentioned earlier, failure to understand that the Chinese leaders would be as determined as they were to hold on to not just their monopoly on political power, but also their non-market economic system. And so what could have been done was not that there was no holding globalization back. And the failure was not, for instance, there are some people that say, well, what's happened since 2001 shows that we should never let China, we should never improve what's called PNTR, permanently normal trade relations with China, which was a precursor to letting them join the WTO. We shouldn't have done that. We should have somehow kept China out. That was not an option. The United States did not have the power to keep China out of the WTO. And also, how would we have justified that in the late 1990s? How would we have justified keeping up an enormous developing country that wanted, at the time, said it wanted to become part of the rules-based global trading system, wanted to become open to market economics? How would we have justified saying, no, you can't. You have to stay poor and backwards, because we're worried 30 years from now you might be a problem for us. So to me, it's a red herring to say that was possible or should have been done. But we were like a person who goes out, during inclement weather and doesn't bring an umbrella. We could see clouds up in the horizon, some people could, but we left the umbrella at home, and we shouldn't have. And Clinton saw this. One of the last speeches he gave as president to the World Economic Forum in Davos, when he was sort of taking a victory lap to the state of the U.S. economy, but also warning again of the need to address these distributional costs of globalization, what he called the winners and losers. And he had always said that the gains for the winners that there would be winners and losers, but the gains for the winners would be so great that they could afford to provide the necessary assistance to the so-called losers, the people like those disadvantaged factory workers. And whether it was relocation assistance, retraining assistance, income support, place-based strategies to sort of trying to rescue some of these hard-hit communities. that was all on the menu. People knew what could have been done, but it never happened. And in the speech in 2000, Clinton said, look, the economy's going gangbusters. If we don't do this now, we'll never do it. And he was right. We never did it.
There are countless incredible examples. China's economic rise is unparalleled in history, and presumably, at least in my lifetime, will never happen again. 1991, the fall of the Soviet Union, the Soviet economy was roughly the same size as China's. The Russian economy now, obviously that's without the other Soviet states, but still, China's economy is 10 times larger than Russia. It's depending on how you measure it, purchasing power, energy, one rates. It's comparable.
I think that was a dollar terms.
Dollar terms, okay, but comparable now to which way we're doing that to the United States. You mentioned earlier in the early 2000s, you're in China, fascinating time to be there. Maybe the Chinese themselves are optimistic. Even before the 2008 global financial crisis that really comes from the United States, extremely risky, less regulated, had a hazardous mortgage lending practices and subsequent borrowing occurs. You mentioned the book that by about 2005, 2006, real concerns were starting to emerge that it wasn't, you knew that if they're not openly politically, that's maybe to be expected. But some of the open free market economic moves they had been making were starting to get reversed. When did you get a sense that, oh no, this is turning around and China is really going to disregard the kind of global norms of trade and economic kind of integration?
Yeah, I claim no clairvoyance on any of these issues. I think I was slow to recognizing, and I think some of my thinking, I was probably reflecting what I was hearing from U.S. officials and economists at the time, because first the Chinese in the 90s had done an extraordinary amount of work to get their system. To try and start moving their system in line with what was going to be required to be a WTO member. And in the late 90s and even after they joined, just an extraordinary amount of really the most arduous kind of regulatory rewriting and change and training their officials and changing hundreds or thousands of their laws, all to change, a Maoist economic, Maoist command economy into something that would at least cohere a little bit with market principles. It took an extraordinary amount of work. They were quite sincere about it. They did a lot. Western officials looked at that, saw it, and said, okay, well, these guys are moving in the right direction. And so when things started to slow down in terms of reform momentum, I think as early as 2003. And what was probably not fully understood at the time, certainly by me, but also by people in the government, was that there were still interests within the Chinese system that were pushing back against this. That even though a decision had been made at the highest levels to proceed with reform and opening and join the WTO, there were still powerful interests in the state enterprises and various levels of the bureaucracy that didn't want to do that. And there was also an understanding on the part of the Chinese leadership of the goals that U.S. and other Western officials had for political change in China. Every time somebody in the United States or on the floor of the United States Senate would say, and I quote a number of these sentences, a number of these comments rather, that, hey, there's no better way, what better way to bring democracy to China than bring them into the WTO? Because inevitably, this will mean they'll have to let in more sources of information, a freer exchange of views, there'll be more people coming into the country. Inevitably, that's going to weaken the Communist Party's control over things, and this will lead to political pluralism. Well, they could hear us when we were saying that. And Jiang Zemin, the president at the time, gave a speech to a party conclave and said explicitly, look, this is how the Western officials think they're going to bring down our system. They think this is how they're going to change us the way they did it in the Soviet Union. And we, the communists, have to be vigilant to not let that happen. So the reform momentum starts to end as soon as 2003. A couple years after that, in the run to the Beijing Olympics, you see more negative developments, a greater internal repression that sort of reversed some of the greater personal and political freedoms that were emerging in the years that I was there, and a greater turn back towards state control of things that should have been loosened up in terms of the economy. So it was starting to happen even before Xi Jinping comes to power in 2012, which is what most people date with the turn. And it's become, I think, popular or customary to sort of think of contemporary China as before Xi and after Xi. And in fact, the worrying trends had started sooner than that.
And then turning back to our side of the Pacific, roughly the same period of time, 2005, 6, 7, into the financial crisis, global financial crisis that comes out of here. You cover very well in the book. There is desperation and fear that comes from working class people from the left, from the right, typical white, non-college educated male voters in a lot of industrial areas, especially Midwest, key electoral college states that might have traditionally been, Democrats or maybe Reagan, they're Reagan Democrats, Reagan supporters. But that a huge switch is happening. It might be a small part of the population, but they're key demographic in those handful of swing states that will determine our elections. Can you talk about how that really mirror and kind of, I think you mentioned your book, I think maybe in the course of about 2 years, U.S. public opinion on globalization went from relatively positive to extremely negative in a very short period of time. How did that happen?
Well, I think, first of all, the numbers on public sentiment about trade were very positive under Clinton as he was making that case, during the NAFTA debate, 93-ish, 92, 93, and then forward. Trade had been very contentious. His argument, look, this is the bridge to the 21st century, and we got to welcome change, we can't fight it, etc. He carried the public with him to a certain degree. But in the years after, I came back from China in 2005, and I can recall by then, between 2005 and the financial crisis, there was a souring. As you start to see more stories about poor or dangerous product quality coming out of China, more stories about Chinese spying, industrial espionage in particular, that was costing companies. And I think you asked earlier about what's called with economists called the China shock, which was the impact of this flood of low-cost Chinese goods across multiple industries, initially in basic manufacturing, that accelerated an ongoing loss of manufacturing jobs. This didn't start the process. Manufacturing job employment has been declining since the 1950s, thanks to automation, just as agricultural employment started declining after the turn of the 20th century, thanks to automation, perfectly natural process of development. But the introduction of greater trade liberalization accelerated this process around the time that China joined the WTO. Between 2000 and 2003, we lost about 3 million manufacturing jobs, not all due to trade by any measure. Most of those would probably be due to automation, just as is customarily the case. But that loss in that 3-year span was 10 times the pace of the previous 3 years. So it was clearly accelerating. And again, in the absence of any meaningful government assistance, people were more or less left to fend for themselves. A lot of those communities there, again, led the financial crisis, which, as I mentioned, was exacerbated by unfettered global capital flows, a weak banking regulation. And so by the time you come out of the financial crisis, you now have communities that have absorbed multiple shocks. And then you have 6 years of the weakest economic recovery in the post-World War II era because of a premature trying to go into austerity. 6 straight years where the budget deficit goes down at a time when unemployment is still high, the economy is still weak, and by traditional economic standards, you'd want to go to pumping more demand into the economy, not taking demand out of the economy. And so that sets the stage for 2016. Looked at through the lens of these communities that are by then desperate for an anti-establishment figure to do something other than what's been done for the previous decade and a half. The stage was really set for you. The ground was right for you like Trump because there are the wake of the 2016 vote. There were a lot of academic analyses of what had driven his win. Was it economic discontent? Was it immigration concerns? What was it that really accounted for it? It was such a narrow win, 40,000 votes over 14 million votes across those 3 Democratic blue wall states. If 40,000 out of 14 million had gone the other way, Hillary Clinton would have been the president. So to my mind, that is such a narrow win that it's impossible to nail down one specific variable that accounts for it. My understanding of the Trump phenomenon, and I can say this is shared by people as disparate as Hillary Clinton herself and Steve Bannon, is that it was a confluence of those factors, that both trade and immigration working together, and this populist tribune who represented as short an electoral choice as we've seen in decades, I think, right? So if you're somebody in one of those communities who's been desperate to vote for somebody like Trump or to vote for change in Washington, really meaningful change, 2008, Obama's your choice. 2012, it's Obama or Romney. Well, that's not much of a choice from the perspective of somebody who wants to burn down the system. 2016, now you got a choice.
And Bernie Sanders, many people would say, obviously different methods or ways he would carry it out, but riding extreme populism, desperation, and kind of fear and desperation as well. Another thing I really found very interesting in your book was, again, globalization more broadly. What's not seen is the massive increase in the flow of capital all across the world, especially from what we think of as the developed and beta world, the United States, Japan, Europe, to the developing world, China, and other places. I think you mentioned the first 5 years China was in the WTO, 2001, 2006. The U.S. trade deficit doubled in only 5 years. And part of the problem is China has tens of billions of dollars, but they don't have or want to really buy any U.S. goods. So what do they do with it? Can you talk about how, and it got risky, especially the financial crisis, Chinese in 8-10 years owned $1 trillion of U.S. treasuries, securities, also very large amounts of mortgage-backed securities for Fannie Mae, Freddie Mac. In the book, I think you mentioned Putin talking to Chinese and saying, "Don't listen to Americans. If you want to, sell off all of this, let it go, let it go." Luckily, the Chinese probably didn't. Can you talk about how the complete flip of the parent and child, the child and parent relationship got flipped in terms of who owes what, in terms of where the money is?
Yeah, well, that anecdote about the Russians trying to get the Chinese to sell their U.S. assets in the middle of the financial panic could have been devastating. Comes from Hank Paulson, who was the Treasury Secretary at the time, who was, of course, intimately involved in those discussions. But the capital flow is really the flip side of the trade deficit. And I don't want to get too far into the weeds on this, but just as an arithmetic relationship, that what's called the current account and the capital account of the U.S. economy have to net to zero. So if we're running a big trade deficit with the rest of the world, we will be importing a lot of capital, which can be a good thing. But the extent of the trade deficit in those years and the river, we had essentially two rivers of money coming into the country in those years from Asian central banks and then from European banks. And the simplest way to think about it was that in Asian, think of it as mostly the Chinese People's Bank of China, are basically taking all the money, all the dollars they end up with because we're buying so much Chinese stuff, and they've got to do something with those dollars. So they buy U.S. Treasury securities because they're super safe, AAA rated. They buy agency securities from Fannie Mae, Fannie and Freddie. And between 2003 and 2007, those Asian purchases accounted for all of the net new issuance of debt by the U.S. Treasury and the agencies, all of it, which is extraordinary. And that has the effect of driving down yields on a 10-year yield, almost a full percentage point lower than it would have been in the absence of those flows. Now that effectively makes mortgages cheaper for people and makes mortgage refinancing cheap. It becomes cheaper. That fuels consumption boom, fuels the housing boom at a time when that fire, that bubble mix of metaphors, but that bubble was already well enough inflated. At the same time, European banks, who previously have been in treasuries, those yields are going down. The European banks want a good return from something that they can regard as safe as treasuries, almost as safe. That's when they start binging on the mortgage-backed securities. The credit rating agencies wrongly identified as equally safe, and that contributes to the problem as well.
And if you have any questions, my colleagues have those cards for the past few minutes, but maybe one or two more while they're collecting those. I think, in terms of like, where are we now? But roughly, I guess, manufacturing in the U.S. economy represents 10 to 12% of our economy, but they're key jobs in key swing states and should not be disregarded. Those people are suffering. But you discussed towards the end of the book that it's probably much more important for the U.S. to be looking forward, that a lot of those jobs, sadly, are never coming back, either from automation or too hard to compete with low-cost producers elsewhere. But we should be looking to, strengthening, supporting the export, so to speak, of our services industry, which is the bulk of our economy, 60, 70%. We should be looking at staying on the cutting edge of AI. What you discussed in the book, but what are you spoke with the presidents, you spoke with the Federal Reserve chairmen, for the highest economists and trade representatives in the United States, all across different parties. What do you think was their kind of prescription of where it should go now?
Well, the way I look at it is both of the last three presidencies, the last two presidents, have both focused on what I think was fighting the last war, which is trying to recover the manufacturing jobs that have disappeared over the last 20 years or so. And despite all those efforts, despite all the first Trump tariffs, despite Biden's industrial policy, despite all the tariffs that we've seen this year, which we'll talk about more later if you will, manufacturing employment continues to slide. And so we're really spinning into the wind on this. There's no precedent for any advanced economy to turn around the decline in manufacturing employment that we've seen everywhere. I've even noticed, I don't think the president talks that much about manufacturing jobs as he used to. He talks a lot about manufacturing, but I think the message is starting to get across, particularly from all the discussion of AI and data centers and the like, that even if the current tariff policy, which of course has lifted effective tariffs to their highest level since the 1930s, even if that does encourage some additional manufacturing work to be based in the United States. And job gains are going to, I think, pretty modest. At least that's the evidence from any economic study I've seen to date. And I think it's misleading to suggest to voters that you're going to be able to deliver these jobs. And there's also a question of the demand for it. There's a statistic that I think is still accurate. There were something like 400,000 current openings in the manufacturing sector. And that was true last year, too. 400,000 openings. These jobs are not getting the interest from younger people that the industry would like to see. The manufacturing industry has run a number of programs, has a number of ongoing efforts to try and get people to come into manufacturing. We're also, even before Trump returned to office, we were near full employment, at a near full employment. So, you have to effectively lure somebody from some other job to come into manufacturing. And what economists call the manufacturing wage premium, was just a fancy way of saying manufacturing used to pay better than other typical blue-collar work, hasn't been true for something like 10 years. So what we think of is sort of, the heyday of manufacturing, which was often unionized, big factories, thousands of guys and gals making, good wages, lavish benefits. Those aren't often the jobs that are out there, certainly in great numbers to pay.
Well, good, interesting question, something you discuss kind of throughout the book. Festus asks, did the wars in the Middle East, in Iraq, and Afghanistan prevent President Bush from reversing job losses with China? It relates to that, during that period, would Japan, Germany, South Korea have been able to kind of take advantage of that distraction?
Well, if you mean that, absent the wars, would Bush have done something different on the domestic policy front to address the issues that I've been talking about? I would say the answer is no. I interviewed Bush in 2006, I think it was, in a Harley-Davidson plant up in York, Pennsylvania. And this was around the time that Hank Paulson was starting to talk about the need to do more for hard-hit factory communities. And I asked Bush whether he thought that was true. We needed new initiatives, new government programs. And he said no, he thought that the existing system was out. Well, the existing system, the centerpiece of it is something called the Trade Adjustment Assistance Program, which dates to 1962, has always been chronically underfunded and ineffective. Everybody in industry and labor knows that. Something like, 1/3 was, I think it's only 1/3 of the people who went through the program even end up getting jobs that they're trained for. Another labor department state found the workers would be better off just working on their own, not even going through the government paid training. So it seemed pretty clear that more needed to be done, but I think Bush's view of the appropriate role for government and the value of retraining was such that the wars certainly dominated the administration's thinking and may arguably have made it more difficult for them to respond as aggressively as they otherwise might have to China's rise, but I wouldn't have expected anything different on the domestic front.
And I think probably in terms of budget and deficits, I think probably the first time in American history, in the middle of a major war, instead of selling war violence and raising money, we actually had tax cuts, doing it out of. But sorry, just two questions, somewhat related. Just for the sake of time, I'll combine some of these. Makar asks, can you discuss more of the role that technology played in job losses versus, just direct trade? And then related to that, what does history teach us? There's not made this one. What does history teach us about the efficacy of tariffs in terms of protecting jobs and actually stimulating U.S. or domestic production? So yeah, so automation, I suppose you touched upon it a bit, that it's obviously a major factor.
Yeah, there's no question that automation is the dominant force in manufacturing job loss. The economic studies that are done are a little bit all over the map on the specific shares. They're at the low end. I've seen a study by a couple of economists from the University of Maryland that put the automation role in the loss from manufacturing over the period of the China shock years at 1/3. The high end, from a very well-regarded economist at the University of Indiana, is something like 88%. So there's a big gap in there. That's because these findings come from economic models. Nobody goes out and takes a census and tries to identify each of the X million jobs. Why was that job lost? I'm not even sure that'd be possible. So economists model this, and based on assumptions, and so depending on what your model is and how you run it, you get a difference. I think if you had a movie full of economists here, and thank God we don't, but if we did, and we polled them, I would bet most would say somewhere around 75% of the job loss comes from automation. I think that's a reasonable assumption. And then what was the second question?
Sure. The second part was
Tariffs. Thank you.
It's easy to explain away why tariffs don't work, but if you don't do them, there are also blowbacks that come.
Well, the problem with tariffs is they really are the proverbial double-edged sword. If I'm a steel worker and we put tariffs on steel, I'm happy because my steel company, we just made the foreign steel more expensive, right? So my company, the domestic American company, let's say I work for U.S. Steel, foreign steel that U.S. Steel competes with just got more expensive. So what is U.S. Steel going to do? They're going to raise their prices. Not quite as much, but just ensure we're going to raise the prices. Now that's great for U.S. Steel. We'll have more revenue coming in. Maybe I'll get a bigger Christmas bonus. Maybe they'll hire more steel workers, expand production. That's great for U.S. Steel and domestic steel makers. What's not to like? Well, Roman works for Ford, and Ford buys steel to make cars. Well, that steel just got more expensive. So now they've got to raise their car prices, not going to sell as many cars. Now they're not going to have as many auto workers. So they're going to blame on and on. And the studies that came out of the first Trump administration concluded that something like 10 people lost their jobs in steel using companies for every steel worker that was hired. So it's very much a trade-off. Now that doesn't mean, or at least I don't think it means, that you should never put a tariff on any good, but you should understand when you do, it's a trade. The president likes to talk about tariffs as if they're paid by foreign countries. That's just not true. It's a simple matter of fact that tariffs are paid by the U.S. importer of record. Now, it's possible that the U.S. importer of record could be a subsidiary of a foreign company. So maybe Samsung has and I don't know that this is the case, but let's say Samsung has a U.S. domicile, separate entity that can import and can be an importer of record. So that might fall on foreign company, but no foreign country is paying any tariffs. And there are trade-offs that we should be aware of.
And I'll just try and get through this quickly because I know it's for the sake of time. If you don't mind hanging out,
I got nowhere to go. Kind of have a client tomorrow morning.
I'm volunteering, David, to sign all your books on the back. The two related questions. The first one, he doesn't have a name. That's fine. But someone asked, why did we suddenly believe that China would become democratic when other countries didn't? Is the media to blame to a degree? And Jason asked, related to that, why was there an expectation that free markets would promote democracy? Capitalism is not inherently democratic in any way.
Yeah, true. I think that I tried to cover the reason why we thought that earlier. And I want to be clear, it's not that people in senior positions necessarily thought that China was going to become a democracy like France or Canada or something like that. But the expectation was that China would liberalize politically, that and there were signs of this. In the late 1990s, the Communist Party was starting to experiment with elections down at the village level, the absolute lowest level of government. Now, they were competitive elections of Communist Party members. So, it wasn't like there was a communist and non-communist option, but starting from the status quo of no elections, never, to introduce these sort of competitions within the party at the lowest level seemed like baby steps in a positive direction. And there were China scholars at the time who would say, well, this is how they're going to start, and it's going to be villages for a few years, and they'll work out the kinks, and then they'll move up to a larger municipality, and then in a couple of years, maybe they'll do the provinces, and who knows, maybe in 10 years or 20 years, you could envision some sort of national competition. Now, from the perspective of today, that seems silly and naive, but again, in that period of time when so much tremendous change has happened, I mean, I'll say for myself, I was born in the closing days of the Eisenhower administration. I never thought I'd see the Berlin Wall come down. I thought had it been there my entire life, I expected it to be there for the rest of my life. The Soviet Union seemed like a permanent feature of the landscape. I didn't think there was any chance of the Soviet Union just disappearing. So if you lived through those kind of experiences against that backdrop, it's not quite so crazy to think that maybe China would become, realistic at some point.
And I mean, for me, one of our greatest strengths of the country is our optimism. And other countries say we're too optimistic, but it's part of why we've been so successful and have done great things. Just want to do this question and then last two to finish it after this. Always like great questions from students. Sophia from the Audi International School asked, can you discuss the unprecedented gap between China and Russia's economy, and how does that dictate Russia's war in Ukraine, and I suppose its reliance and need for China's support? And the second question, there's no name on it, but they ask, what else could the U.S. do strategically from a trade standpoint to pressure Russia with regards to the Ukraine war and some sort of peace agreement?
A huge gap between the Chinese and Russian economies, and it's created a much more imbalanced relationship than has previously been the case. And Chinese leaders, in particular Xi Jinping, are determined not to go the way of the former Soviet Union. So, for years, they have been leading heavy instructions and training and exhortations, all designed to draw lessons from what happened in the Soviet Union and not have them repeated in China. And as for what we could do to further pressure Russia economically, there's been a bill that's been prepared and has been sitting in the Senate for some time that would drop the hammer, I think, on what remains of Russia's oil trade. That could be tremendously disruptive, and there could be blowback. And to date, the president hasn't shown any interest in going that route. So I don't think that's likely to happen anytime soon.
And just for sake of time, we discussed obviously Clinton, Bush 43, Obama, the first Trump administration. You very notably, as fairly point out, in many ways, the most extreme kind of change in American economic policy and protectionism has come under Biden rather than even Trump. He maintained most of his tariffs on China. In some ways, he expanded tariffs and subsidies. But just to kind of bring things to a conclusion, Michael, another great student from Audi International School, asked, something you discussed in the book as well, in terms of supply chains, is the U.S. moving towards resilience over efficiency? In the book, the former idea of just in time to now needing just in case. the change in supply chains, how does that impact us? And there's no name on this one, but it's a good question and a great way to finish it. What would be your blueprint for smarter globalization without drifting into market economic nationalism?
That should be the sequel.
Part two. Yes.
Yeah, I wouldn't say that Biden's turn to protectionism was more dramatic, certainly, that we've seen over the last 10 months.
Not this term, but I'd say relative to this first term.
It was certainly significant. I'll say two things. First, it was enormously significant at the time in that it represented a real break with his Democratic predecessors. If you look at Biden on trade and compare him to the president he served as vice president, Barack Obama, and Bill Clinton, Biden looked much more like what he really is, like a union-affiliated Democrat, and one who had always been sort of open to trade, but not a real believer in the agenda. And I would say when I was writing the book, certainly when I began writing the book, I personally was working on it with the assumption that Biden was going to be the end of the book, and that I'd be covering a second Biden term or a second Democratic term. I would confess that in my naivete, I did not anticipate a second Trump administration. So what little there is about Trump to him at the end of the book was written in January, within about a week of Inauguration Day. But in terms of a roadmap for globalization without economic nationalism.
Yeah, and you talked about kind of nearshoring, friendshoring,
I think
supply chain.
I think where Trump too deserves credit is they have taken dramatic steps on what are called rare earth minerals, which I'm familiar with folks on that term's been in the news a fair bit over the past few months. But these are substances that are mined out of the ground and are needed for everything from smartphones and electric vehicle motors to jet fighters and satellites and every bit of hardware we would need if we were to get into a fight with China, and we depend on China to provide those minerals, which is not a good position to be in. So the administration has taken a number of efforts they're moving quite aggressively to try and develop a non-China supply chain for that. And that's going to take a long time because it takes about 30 years to get into this predicament. But I think they deserve credit for moving out on that. I do think that notion of resilience and a heightened awareness of vulnerability is clearly in the cards, and is clearly going to dominate thinking going forward, no matter who's elected in 28. We have seen a sea change really in attitudes on this, and that doesn't mean that or stop trade with China. We still do something like $600 billion a year in two-way trade. And even if we were to stop buying if we were never to have another cargo carrier leave a Chinese port until Los Angeles, we would still be getting lots of Chinese products from other countries, either finished products by what's called transshipment, where a Chinese product would go to Vietnam, have a little work done on it, that come from Vietnam to the U.S. But also, even goods that we buy from almost anywhere have Chinese components in them, because China's role in global manufacturing is now so dominant that it's quite hard to find something that doesn't have some little piece of China inside, which makes talk of what's known as decoupling or severing our relationship pretty theoretical.
Just before we conclude again, for yourself, if you want a nice Christmas or Hanukkah or Kwanzaa or any holiday gift, I really recommend it. I learned a lot from myself. I'm not an economics major or a trade person. It was really interesting, but it was written in a way that's kind of fun and enjoyable to read with an array of fascinating characters. We have David's book in the back, The World's Worst Bet, How Globalization Gamble Went Wrong and What Would Make It Right. So please, if you want to get one back there, I'm volunteering David to sign them. And again, so I thank you all so much for everything this year. We really look forward to seeing you next year. And we all please join me in thanking David Lynch. Thank you.
Thank you very much.